I have this tattoo on my wrist. It's of a watch. And a lot of people have come up to me over the years and said, oh, that's a cool tattoo. I should get a tattoo of a watch. But it's not that simple. And I feel like almost like anything in life, there's always a story behind everything. And the same goes for this tattoo of this watch. As you can see, my hand was burned. My arm was burned. But my wrist, it's not burned. The story is because when I joined the United States Army, I couldn't figure out how to tell military time to save my life. I really could not figure it out. And when I got to my unit, which was the 101st out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, one of my sergeants, just to kind of pick on me, and it was all playful, it was fun. He knew I couldn't figure out military time. So he said to me, from now on, when I just look at you, I want you to get down and do push-ups. And so every time he would look at me, we'd be in our headquarters, we'd be in a parking lot, he would find me at a store, and he would just say, Martinez, and I'd look at him, and he'd look at me, and he'd smile, and I'm like, and I had to get down and do push-ups until he told me it was time for me to get up. Eventually, you get tired of doing push-ups, right? And so what I did with my little salary that I got from the Army, I decided to go to the store and buy a really inexpensive Timex watch and set it at 24-hour time. So the next time my sergeant looked at me and said, Martinez, I said, hold on, Sergeant. I actually know the time. The watch saved me. Well, that wasn't the last time that it did. Fast forward to when I'm in Iraq. I'm wearing that watch the day that I was injured. Very inexpensive watch. I'm wearing that watch, and when I get out of come out of my medical-induced coma and I wake up in the hospital, I look at the extent of my injuries and I notice that I don't have burns where the watch was. So what I decided to do was get a tattoo of that watch. And inside the face of the watch, there's zigzags, and we'll do a close-up so you can see this. There's zigzags. It has the time that I was injured, which is right after 2:30 in the afternoon. It has the day that I was injured, which was a Saturday. Then it has the date that I was injured in the band. So 4, 5, 1000, 2000, 1, 2, 3. April 5th, 2003. I got this tattoo because I wanted it to remind me for the rest of my life, every time I look at my wrist, to remind me of not only what I overcame, but also of a day that almost took my life, but also a day that gave me so much life. A lot of veterans refer to that day that they're injured as their alive day. I personally like to call it my rebirth, because I believe it is exactly that. Parts of me died on that day, and other parts of me were born to become this person that I am today, and that many people have come to learn about. But I often get this question: what made you decide to join the military? Talk to us about your injury. Talk to us about what you've been through, what you experienced. How did you get to where you are today? Because when you look at the trajectory and my path, it doesn't necessarily align, right? Like you go to college to be this profession and then you go into that profession. It makes sense. When you look at my life and what I've managed to do over the last 18 years, it doesn't really kind of make sense. It's very much like I'm like the Forrest Gump of life. Like it's just like, okay, I'll try that. Okay, I'll go there. Okay, I'll go for that. But it's so fascinating. When I look at this watch, it just reminds me that I wasn't always that person. There were parts of me that had to grow and evolve and to learn in order to be the person that I am today. So let's get into the story. Let's get into the details. Let's get into the answers, hopefully, to your questions that I've gotten over the years of how. I joined the United States Army September of 2002. I can tell you that I was in a stage of life where I just graduated from high school, and I really wasn't quite sure what it is that I wanted to do with my life. I was kind of in this kind of limbo phase. I had a job locally in town, in a small town in Georgia where I graduated high school from, and I was just going through the motions. Because the plan that I had for myself was to go to college and play sports at the college level. Well, I was told that from an academic standpoint, I would not be eligible to play sports for 2 years, so I decided, well, I'm not going to go to college then. And I'm just going through the motions. What am I doing? Honestly, disappointed in myself. And so it came to the point where when I decided to join the United States Army, I remember approaching my mother and saying, Mom, I have this idea. I have this solution to what I'm going to do. I'm going to join the United States Army. And immediately she said no. Immediately she said no. She said no because my mother's from Central America, a country called El Salvador. And in the early 80s, there was a civil war that was taking place there. My mother has experienced what war does to people, what it does to families. When I was 3 years old, one of my sisters passed away from an illness that she was born with. So my mother has lost a child. I graduated high school in 2002. Most of us remember that a few months before, in 9/11, what transpired? We as a country were already at war in Afghanistan, and there are rumors of us possibly going over to Iraq. So my mother, understanding war, understanding that we currently, as a country, were at war, and that if I joined the military, it would increase the chances of her losing another child, her only son. No, you're not. That's why she was against it. And now at the age of 37 years old, I can understand that approach. I can understand that concept. But I can tell you at that age of 18 years old, soon to be 19, for me, I was like, no, Mom, hear me out. Just listen to me. And one of the greatest gifts my mother gave me as a child was her willingness and ability to actually listen to me, to create space for me to speak, whether she agreed or not. And I can tell you that it was a really long conversation of the both of us talking about the pros and cons of me joining the military and going off to combat, because we knew that that was a possibility. And at the conclusion, my mother said, okay, if this is what you feel is the best thing for you, then I support you. And so I joined the United States Army September 12th, 2002, 1 year and a day after 9/11. I joined as an 11 Bravo, an infantryman, and I can tell you that when I went to basic training for those 3 months, I mean, I was incredibly naive. I was incredibly naive, thinking to myself, it's almost like I'm going to football camp, an extended football camp, just going to hang out with a bunch of guys, because at that time, infantry units were primarily guys. And so I'm going to hang out with a bunch of guys, and we're just going to train and do things that they do in the military. I had nobody that was in my life and my family that had served in the United States military, so there was nobody I could really speak to. It was just me kind of experiencing it for the first time on my own as I went. I was there for 3 months. It was a rude awakening. And I remember throughout basic training, we had a couple of drill sergeants, but one drill sergeant in particular, that he just had this, I mean, just stoic look on his face, like every day. I mean, he meant business every day. Every day, life was not about a game. It was serious. It was to be taken seriously. And he was just one of those guys that you knew he had been somewhere, had done some things, had some experiences, and you respected him and you also feared him. And I can tell you that he frequently would say to us, you're gonna go to war, you're gonna deploy, it's gonna happen. I mean, we're a bunch of young, kids just going through basic training, trying to survive this. And he's trying to tell us, you can't just think of this. You got to think of the bigger picture. Or he was right. I graduated basic training December of 2002. So 3 months later, then I took some time off. Well, they let us go home for a couple of weeks before we were assigned to our units for the holidays. And I was assigned to the 101st out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I remember getting there at the age of 19. And I mean, I smile when I talk about that period because it was an exciting time. It was one of those periods in my life where, I felt that I was on my own. I was doing, I lived on my own now. I lived in the barracks. I had my own car. I was away from my mom. I love my mom, but I was away from her. So a little bit of independence, and I was excited about it. I remember once I was assigned to my actual unit, which was the 50 Deuce Delta Company, and assigned to my platoon and having the commander and just kind of having the team that I was going to be a part of. I remember one day I was goofing around, which if you come to know me a little bit, I'm always goofing around. It's just how I am. And in that element, I was goofing around, joking, and my platoon sergeant tapped me on the shoulder and told me that we needed to talk. And I remember that when we started talking, he said to me, "You need to be prepared because we're going to deploy," is what he said to me. This was my response to that man that had been in the Army for a very long time up until that point. And I said to him, I was like, "I just got out of basic training. I just got to this unit. I'm not going anywhere yet. Like, relax. It's not that big of a deal. You're overthinking it." Now, if you served in the military, if you know someone that has served in the military, you know that there in no branch is it acceptable for you to tell your commander to just relax. It's not that big of a deal. You're overthinking it, especially as a private. Well, after I was done doing push-ups and sit-ups and every other exercise that he wanted me to do as a punishment for telling my superior to relax, he explained that I needed to be prepared to deploy. And he wasn't referencing physically. He was talking about how I needed to be prepared mentally, emotionally. But at the age of 19 years old, how do you really prepare for that? At the age of 19 years old, what life experience really have you had that's going to allow you to adapt to being in a combat environment? There really isn't. I mean, there's some instances where you hear of, children growing up in bad areas. And yes, I kind of fell into a little bit of that category as well. But for the most part, at the end of the day, it's still not combat. Well, he was right. 2 months later, I found myself on a plane with the rest of my unit going to Iraq, going to war. I remember being on a plane ride, sitting in my seat with your gear right at your feet. And it was such a long flight that they put on a movie for us. And they put on a movie, and I remember the movie that they put on is We Were Soldiers. Now, if you haven't seen that movie, oh my God. I mean, it's incredibly powerful movie, but it's real and raw about war. And I'm sitting there as a 19-year-old, flying to another country, to the other side of the world, and watching this film, thinking to myself, oh shit. Like, that's what I'm going to do? That's the environment I'm going to be in for however long, because they didn't tell us a time frame. They said we can be there for 2 weeks up to, whatever amount of time. I mean, they didn't give you a beginning and end date. Now, we kind of thought that we were going to be there for a year. That was the general thought. Get to Iraq. Well, we flew into Kuwait City first, and then I remember getting into the transportation and them transporting us to our campsites, and it was so much to take in at 19 years old, just to see desert, to see sand, to see areas being incredibly isolated, people walking in the middle of nowhere, and you look around and you're like, there's not even one house, one form of shelter for miles that we can see. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? I mean, it was an incredible culture shock. But you also can't lose sight of the fact that you're actually at war. And I remember that there were a couple of instances where we would sit down and one of our sergeants would go over scenarios with us. And he would say, if this were to happen, this is how you respond and this is what you do. If this were to happen, kind of like anybody, right? Like any sports team has a strategy. Any team, whether it's in corporate America or whatever, everybody has a strategy. This is what you do. If this happens, this is what your role is if this happens. And I remember that there were certain scenarios that were presented that if, for example, if somebody were to stand in front of our Humvee as we were driving through a town, not at a high speed, but, inching along, if somebody were to stand in front of our Humvee, you don't stop. Now imagine being 19 years old, being born and raised in the United States of America, spending countless amount of time on the roads in the United States of America, getting your license, your permit and your license, and they tell you that if a pedestrian is in front of you, you stop. To now having to rewire your mind to then understand that, oh, wait, in this environment, if I am to stop, I allow myself and everybody that I'm with to become a target. You can't stop. You have to keep moving. Every time that they would explain scenarios like this, because this is war, this is combat. I can tell you there were so many instances where I would just sit there and just like, wait, and raise my hand. And as a 19-year-old and as a private in the Army, you don't raise your hand. You don't ask questions. You just do. And I remember raising my hand and just like, hold on, Sergeant. So you're saying that I'm supposed, oh, wow. It's a lot to process. It's a lot to wrap your head around. When I joined the United States Army, my vision was I was going to do 3 years. That was it. 3 years. I'll get out when I'm close to 22 years old or 22 years old. I'll have money for college. I would have given back to a country that I felt had given so much to me and my family. I would be able to move on with my life and say that I did something. During this time, I did something. I contributed something. But something really fascinating started to happen in the early days and weeks of being in Iraq. I remember one day getting a briefing from one of our commanders. And this guy was briefing us, and the way that he stood up on this platform, a little elevated, above the rest of us that are sitting on the floor. And he literally looked at every single one of us. And he talked about how incredibly important you were, And in order for you to do your job, you needed you to do your job. And in order for you to do your job, you needed him to do his job. And in order for you to do your job, you needed me to do my. And he just talked about how everybody had a role and a responsibility and was of value. Man, I was like sitting there as a young 19-year-old, like taking this. I mean, this guy looked like a G.I. Joe, like a real life G.I. Joe. I mean, the haircut was short, right? I mean, he had every, medal that you can think of on his uniform. The uniform was, crisp and cream. It was incredible how this guy looked up. He was fit. I just remember looking at him thinking to myself like, yo, this guy is the real deal. Like, I want to be like that guy. I want to be able to have every accolade, every award, every certification like he has on his uniform. But because he talked about how important every single one of us were, my mind started to shift a little bit. I'm sitting there as a young 19-year-old, easily, easy to be persuaded, right? Because I'm still trying to figure out the world and my role in it. And early on, we would go on these missions, and we were one of the units that would help people get from where they were and to where they wanted to go, where they needed to be. And I can tell you that I didn't know any of these individuals. You didn't really spend a lot of time talking. You just said, okay, cool, this is the route we're going to take. Everyone fall in line, and you got there. But I specifically remembering one evening sitting there in my Humvee in the middle of the desert, looking up at the sky, the dark sky, and just thinking about that day, thinking about what that commander said about how every single one of us matter, and then all of a sudden tapping into this feeling that I think a lot of service members understand, this feeling of, oh, wait, that feeling is called service. Oh, wait, I like this feeling. There's nothing in my life up until that point that had ever given me that feeling. And thinking about how I mattered in helping people get from where they were to where they needed to be. And I didn't know those individuals. I didn't know what they were going to go do, but I was led to believe that they were going to go help somebody else. And I was a part of the process of helping them get there. And because I was a part of it, a small part of it as a private, but I was a part of it, suddenly now I bought into service. Suddenly now I thought to myself, I'm not just going to limit this thing to 3 years. Why would I limit myself to 3 years? I want to do this for as long as they'll allow me to. So then I start plotting in my mind. While I'm still in Iraq, I'm plotting. When I come back from this tour, from this deployment, I'm going to put in to go to this school, that school. I want to go to all of these schools. I want to be tapped out by the end of my career in the military. I want to be this highly decorated. I now had a goal, and I wanted to strive to be the best. I think all of us can relate to that, right? All of us have had these moments and instances where we say, oh, next year is going to be my year. Tomorrow is going to be the day. Next month is going to be the month. And then life throws a little wrench into the equation. And the wrench was for me on the 5th of April of 2003. I remember the night before not sleeping a lot. I mean, not that you really could get a lot of sleep, but this particular night, we didn't sleep as much because there was always threats of missiles being shot at us. I remember that. And there was this alarm that was at the base camp where we were. And if they ever felt like there was a threat that was happening, this alarm would go off, this siren. And I remember getting up one night in the middle of the night when the siren went off, and immediately you got to grab your gas mask, you put it on, you clear it, you grab your gear, and you run to a bunker. I remember running to that bunker, staying put in that bunker. We're all tight, crammed into this bunker. And then eventually they come out and they say, okay, clear, we're good, everyone go back. So you go back, take everything off, you lay down in your cot, you try to get some shut-eye for however long, because you're not really sure what time it is. And then all of a sudden the siren went off again, and you got to get up, grab your gas mask again, clear it, grab your weapon, and go to that bunker again, cram in there. We did this twice that night. So naturally, you're not going to get a lot of sleep. So I remember waking up with the 5th of April and just like exhausted, tired, and just thinking to myself, man, I can't wait for the evening. I can't wait for this day to be over. How many times have you woken up and said that to yourself? I can't wait for this day to be over. I said that, and we got our orders for that day, and it was to escort another convoy up north to a city called Karbala. And it's funny, I have people that come up to me, veterans over the years, and have said, you were there in 2003 at the beginning, What was your base? Or you were there and they just know that I was there. Were you at this base? Were you at that base? And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because I was there so early in the conflict, that the names of the bases that I stayed at, that we set up camp, were no longer the names, just a few months later. And so, I can't tell you exactly where I was in Iraq, what region. I know that I was right on that Kuwait border. That's all I really know. There were camps called New York, Pennsylvania. That's all I know. But I remember getting the orders and we had to go north to a city called Karbala to escort this convoy. And I remember driving, I'm the driver, and I'm the extra guy in the car. So I have to do anything and everything that's asked of me. So being a private in this unit, you were the extra man. Whatever they needed, they needed you to drive, you were the driver. They needed you to sit in the back seat, you sat in the back seat and handed supplies or sorted through things. You needed to be the gunner. You needed to be whatever was needed, that was you as the private. That was your way of paying your dues, right? Similar to like a rookie being on a team, and you're gonna just have to do all these things, right? You hear all these stories about athletes that are rookies and they have to buy the food for all the team, or they have to, treat the team. It's just one of those things. Pay your dues. And I remember getting to Karbala, and I was sitting behind the passenger. There was 4 of us in the Humvee. There was a driver, passenger, me sitting behind the passenger, and a gunner, someone up there manning the weapon. And we got a mission that we had to reroute, and the idea is that we had to go north of the city of Karbala and go meet up with some people. I didn't really know much about it. Of course, I was a private. There was no point of me necessarily knowing this information. It was just, hey, this is where we got to go. This is what you got to do. Whatever it was, we had to pull off to the side of the road and wait for a couple of hours for us to determine which route was safe for us to take. I remember getting out of our Humvees, holding our weapons. It's hot. It's in the middle of the day. And I can tell you, I vividly remember standing there with my weapon in the sun and just like dozing off, just hard to keep my eyes open. Of course I was going to feel that way. I started the day exhausted, as I'm sure everybody else did. And then now you have the sun beating on you. Oh, it's a recipe for disaster. I remember after about 2 hours, one of the sergeants came over and he said, all right, we have the route that we're going to take, everyone. So everyone get in your Humvees. And as we all started to walk to the Humvee, my sergeant said to me, Martinez, it's your turn to drive. And I said, no problem, Sergeant. I jumped in the driver's seat. So there was a passenger, somebody sitting behind the passenger, and still that person manning the weapon up top. I jokingly tell people that if you were able to have footage of me in that moment, once I got into that driver's seat and started driving, you would have seen a young 19-year-old with one hand on the steering wheel, right? Had a little bit of a lean. There's not much space in the Humvee for you to have a lean, but I found a little nook for me to have a little lean. I had the Kevlar that you wear in your helmet, your head, that's supposed to protect your head from any sort of impact, shrapnel, things of that nature. I had it casually kicked up on my forehead. Almost similar to like when you go to the store, you're going to run out of the house and you grab a ball cap, you just throw it on. And then I had the window halfway down. Like I literally thought I was cool. Like I literally thought that I was driving this luxury car down Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Like, who did I think I was? But I think that shows you how incredibly naive I was. That even though when I raised my right hand, I understood that war was a possibility, but I never thought it would be my reality. We didn't drive a long time. We didn't drive very far. And I remember that when you're away from freedom and family and friends, what ultimately kind of fills that void and you utilize to help you get through the amount of time that you're away from those three things that you love and miss is humor. Humor. And I remember us joking in the Humvee. I don't remember exactly what it was about, but I remember that we were joking and laughing about something. And then all of a sudden, boom. What happened was the front left tire of the Humvee that I was driving, which was almost essentially right under my feet, ran over a roadside bomb. Immediately, the other three troops were thrown out of the vehicle, all ejected at various distances. The gunner was shot up and he landed and injured his leg. Had to be medevac back to the States because he injured his leg. The other two guys, for what I recall, literally just had shrapnel like in their hand, I think in their lip. But it was small enough to the point where they felt that they can take it out, treat it there on site, and they can stay in combat. But I was trapped inside. I was trapped inside, and within a matter of seconds, this Humvee was now engulfed in flames. When we went on a mission, we took everything with us just in case we didn't make it back to that base camp. We wanted to make sure we had the essentials. So the biggest thing we had, of course, was our gear, our ammo, and fuel in case we broke down. As you can imagine, those three things are a perfect recipe for a Humvee now being caught on fire. I was completely conscious for the 5 minutes that I was trapped inside of that truck. Screaming and yelling at the top of my lungs because of the pain that I was enduring. My ribs were affected as well, so it was hard for me to get air, for me to get oxygen. And I remember while I was in that Humvee, and I can literally see my hands changing. I could literally see my hands changing. And when I say changing, yes, I literally mean the skin on my hands melting. And screaming and yelling, help, help. And in between every single help was a trying to get oxygen. Being completely conscious, I mean, those 5 minutes, of course, felt like a complete eternity. I had these moments where my eyes would get very heavy and they would get to the verge of closing, and I would allow them to close. And when they were closed, I remember thinking to myself, God, it feels so good. It feels so good to just have my eyes closed, to let go, to not fight, to not scream. But I could tell you that I equally understood that if I kept my eyes closed, this would be it. I'm giving up. And in my mind, I had no other reason to believe that, no, somebody's going to come and pull me out, because, of course, I felt like I was in there for days, hours. But in my mind, I was like, no, I can't keep my eyes closed. And I would open my eyes and I would continue that vicious cycle of screaming and yelling at the top of my lungs. There's two things I want to touch on before I move on to what happened to me after I get pulled out of this Humvee. The first thing is that sister that passed away from an illness that she was born with when I was 3 years old, I never met her. Her name, Anabel. She was born in El Salvador, and she remained in El Salvador when my mother came to the United States looking for a better opportunity. She stayed with my grandmother. I never met her. I'm sure I spoke to her on the phone, but I was a toddler. What conversation could I actually have, and what conversation would I actually remember? What I do remember is when my mother got the call and what house we were living in, and how my mother was on the other side of the bed crying, emotional, and me coming in at the age of 3 years old, seeing my mother crying, hearing her cry, and going up to her because she's my hero and just telling her, I love you, mommy, it's okay, because that's all I could say. Fast forward to 9 years old. This is the second time now I go to El Salvador, and I go to my sister Annabelle's gravesite for the first time in my life. And I'm standing there and I'm overwhelmed with emotion. I cannot make any sense as to why I feel such a emotional connection, a pull. My mother doesn't understand it. My other sister doesn't understand it. My other sister, who's the oldest, spent most time with her. But I just have this, nobody understood it. I came home, just kind of moved on with my life. When I was 16 years old, where I was in life, I felt a little isolated, out of place. I felt like I didn't have a community. I was still trying to discover who I was. I was still trying to understand who I felt outside of my mother was in my corner. I remember telling my mother one day that I actually have thoughts and visions of getting into a car accident because I want to see how many people would actually show up at the hospital. How many people would actually show me that they care. On the 5th of April of 2003, being in that Humvee, literally burning alive, I got the clarity to those two stories. The first, at 16, I said I wanted to get into a car accident. Here it is. I wanted to find out how many people would actually show up and care for me. Oh, I found out. Incredible amount of people showed up and to show love and support and encourage me. But in the midst of me screaming and yelling at the top of my lungs, all of a sudden, there was this peacefulness and this quietness that just came over me. And I remember actually seeing my sister. My sister Annabelle, in the only way that I'd ever seen her. There's one photo that I've ever seen of her in the dress that she's wearing. And I remember having the vision of her appearing to me and speaking to me and telling me that I was going to be okay. And then within a matter of seconds being pulled out of the Humvee. You can take what you want from that. The point is, one, be careful what you say and what you think. I wanted to get into an accident. I got in one. And the second thing is, not everything is going to make sense in the moment. We all know that. Not everything's going to make sense 6 months from that point, a year from that point. For me, it was 10 years later when I finally got my answer to why I felt this incredible connection to my sister whom I never met. My interpretation? She's my guardian angel. She's with me. She's got my back. That's why we named my daughter Lauren Annabelle. I'm pulled out of the Humvee. I'm laying on my back in the sand, and I'm screaming and yelling at the top of my lungs. I'm telling my Sergeant Valdez, who comes to my aid, and he picks my head up, and he's on his knees, and he's rocking me. And the whole time he's telling me, it's okay, baby boy. You're going to be okay, baby boy. You're going to be okay, baby boy. Just hang in there, baby boy. I remember reaching up and grabbing his top and pulling down at his top and telling him, my face, my face. He never called me baby boy before that. He was definitely like a big brother to me, but he never called me baby boy. And even though he's telling me to be calm, that I was going to be okay, that everything was going to be all right, those are the right words to allow me to relax and feel at peace and be calm, but his tone didn't support it. So it didn't necessarily put me at ease. If anything, it scared me even more. Because this guy, prior to this moment, for the 3 months that I've known him, has always kind of had this look on his face, was always about his business, kind of chuckled here and there, but for the most part was just a guy that just did his job, made sure he looked after his troops. Well, shortly after, I was put on a helicopter and I was medevaced and I was sent to a local medic station set up in Iraq. When I got to that medic station, they decided to put me into a medical induced coma for a couple of reasons. One, my body was going through shock. So what I was told later by a couple of people is I was literally fighting everyone, telling them that I was okay, that I'm fine, just let me be. And the second reason they decided to put me into a medical induced coma was if he survives, because it was a big question, if he survives, he's going to need all of this energy. So let's preserve it. And it also will allow us to do what we need to do to give him a chance. I went to Launchstool, Germany. I went into emergency surgery. They cut my stomach open. They cleaned me up, made sure everything was okay there. Because I also had inhaled all the smoke from the fire, so that did damage. Because that was the biggest thing that was threatening whether I was going to survive or not. And after 3 days, once I was stable, they put me on a plane and brought me back to the United States. And I went to the burn center for the United States military, which is Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. 3 weeks later, I wake up out of my coma. Doctor's standing by my bedside. My mother's standing on the other side. This doctor explains to me, this is where you are. This is exactly what happened to you. And there's a lot of things that you have a lot of limitations, in other words. But don't worry. We have a team here that's trained and qualified, and we're going to get you back. He says, but you're tired, so just rest tonight, and then I'll come in tomorrow morning, and we'll talk to you about the routine that we have for you. I was tired. I did sleep. And as promised, he came in the following morning and he meant business. And he said, all right, listen, by now you notice you can't do anything for yourself. You can't go to the bathroom by yourself. You can't feed yourself. You can't walk. You don't know how to walk. I barely had enough strength to pick up a remote and actually press the button. I immediately lost like 50 pounds. So I went from being like this 185, 90 pound kid to all of a sudden being 145, maybe 140 pounds. It was incredibly fragile. And then and add the element that I didn't have skin because I had 3rd-degree burns. And even though I was only burned 34% of my body, most of that was 3rd degree. I say only, not to downplay what I've been through or other people that have similar injuries. I say only because I met and I know people that have been burned a lot more than I have. The first few weeks of being in that hospital were challenging. As you can imagine, the routine, this is what it looked like. Every morning I'd wake up at 7:30 in the morning. They would come in, they would feed me breakfast. Literally, the nurse would feed me breakfast. After that, they would put me on this shower bed and they would take me to the shower and they would bathe me. Now, every burn survivor will tell you the worst part of the whole recovery process is when they take you to the shower. And if you got a sensitive stomach, I ask you right now, maybe fast forward about 15, 20 seconds. Because what they literally have to do is scrub and get all of the dead skin and everything off of the area that's burned. We underestimate what the skin does for us, this layer of protection. And when you don't have it and someone's touching, it's incredibly sensitive. And you can take the toughest person you know and put them in that environment. Not that I wish that on anybody, But I guarantee you, you can stand outside of that burn ward and you would still hear that individual screaming and yelling at the top of their lungs. I was no different. I remember that I couldn't actually consume water. So I had dry mouth, and I remember just screaming and yelling. And my nurse, Mike, who was always incredible, the team that I had was incredible. Bonnie, incredible. And I would always ask Mike, why are you doing this to me? And Mike was like, I have to. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry, buddy. I have to. He always responded with such grace. I went through this for a while, and I just remember, for the first couple of weeks of going through this, every time I would go back into my ICU room, I would just be overwhelmed with emotion. I remember actually one particular day being wheeled back into my ICU room, and they kept it so warm it had to be it had to be really warm in the ICU, and so they really couldn't dry you off like you typically do, like when you get out of a shower or you get out of a pool. Instead, they would just let me lay there for a few minutes, and I would essentially dry up. But I remember that we would always, after we went through the routine of coming back from the shower, and then we had to move to the stage of the nurse applying creams and dressings to my wounds, and we would always put on San Antonio radio on the TV. And I I know this sounds corny, but I remember laying in my hospital bed, overwhelmed with emotion and just thinking about, why does it hurt so much every time he touches my face, every time he touches my body? Why do I scream and yell at the top of my lungs? And as I'm sitting there processing all of this, thinking about all of this, all of a sudden, Christina Aguilera's song, "You Are Beautiful No Matter What They Say." Of course, I didn't really pay attention to the lyrics because I didn't know the extent of my injury. But the point is that later, when I really thought about that day and hearing that song, to me, it was just one of those signs of life. It was one of those moments that was just kind of putting something out there in the air, in the universe. And it was up to me to receive it. That day, I asked my nurse, Mike, if I can see my face for the first time. He said, okay. So he picked me up. He helped me over to this chair. I had my head down, and I remember him putting up a mirror in front of me from the food tray. It has like this compartment. You slide it back, and then the mirror, pops up. And I had my head down, and he said to me, okay, buddy, the mirror's right in front of you. But before you look, he said, I want you to know two things. One, what you're going to see is not the same person that you've known your whole life. And two, and most importantly, you have to trust me and believe me when I tell you that it's going to get better. It's just one of those moments in my life where I felt like I just heard what he said. I didn't really listen to him. Because in my mind, I'm just trying to prepare myself for what I'm about to see, even though I don't really know what to prepare myself for. And all of a sudden, I take a deep breath and I pick my head up slowly. And my eyes meet the mirror. I turned my head as much as I could to each side to see how bad it was. And I'd seen enough. I picked up my right arm and I pushed the mirror away. Immediately, I started to cry. And I looked at Mike and I hit him with that question that all of us at some point in our lives we've asked. Why? Why? Why do I look like this? Why did this happen to me, Mike? Mike had no words. It's impossible to expect him to have any words. Shortly after, I remember talking to my doctor because I fell into this space of being depressed and angry. And I remember talking to my doctor and and asking my doctor, so when can I go back? When can I get out of the hospital and go back? I asked him. He said to me, you're not going to be able to remain in the United States Army. You're going to be medically discharged. Whew, man. I literally lost 2 identities within a short few days. The first one being my appearance, the way I looked. I lost that person. I didn't recognize this new person every time I looked in the mirror. The second identity was being in uniform. I was starting to connect with this vision of being of service, and I wanted to do that for as long as they would allow me to. And now you're telling me I can't even wear that uniform and do this thing that I have fallen in love with, which is service. So then what? So then what do I do with my life then? You're going to throw me into society looking like this? Such a judgmental society? I was pissed. I was angry. I was depressed. My mother every day would come into my room first thing in the morning and visit with me, and she would just sit at the foot of my bed and help me if I needed help doing something, but for the most part, she just stayed there. Every evening when she would leave to go back to her room to sleep for the night, she would say, I love you, son. I love you, mijo, is what she would say. I would say nothing to her. I would lay in my hospital bed, looking out of those big windows, turning my head as much as I could to look outside of these huge windows that looked out into downtown San Antonio. And I would see these lights like a festival was happening. I later learned that during that time, there's a festival that happens downtown called Fiesta. And they have rides and they have music and food. And I could actually see the lights. And in my head, sometimes I felt like I can hear some noise. I mean, that noise could be coming from anywhere. But I would sit there and look outside of that window and just think to myself, there's a whole world out there that I want to be a part of. But I never will. I never will be a part of that world because, yeah, I'm alive, but I'm never going to live. And there's a difference. There's a lot of people that are alive that aren't living. And I'm going to fall into that category. Man. I remember just not wanting to live at all. I had nightmares about the day that I was injured. I would randomly wake up in the middle of the night, sit up and scream and yell. There's no hope. And one day my mom came into my room and we sat down and she said, listen, I don't know why this happened to you. I'm just asking you to do a few things for me. Try to be positive. Try to have faith. Try to believe that something good will come from this. And in that moment, I had nothing else to hold on to. And so I just had to say, okay, I guess. So every morning when I woke up, and let me tell you again, if you have a sensitive stomach, you might want to fast forward about 30 seconds right now. Because I remember that when I would wake up in the morning and I would sit up, because I had to sleep on my back because of the burns all over and I couldn't sleep on my side. And I remember that I would sit up. And as I started to sit up, I would feel a tug, something kind of little resistance preventing me from getting up right immediately. And I would finally break through that and I would sit up. I would turn around and look back at the pillow only to find little pieces of my ear, of the skin. That because I sat in that position for so long, that it stuck to the pillowcase. And when I would get up in the morning, it was on the pillow. When I tell that story, as kind of gut-wrenching as it may be to hear it, and even for me to hear myself say that was my experience, for me, it's symbolic of what April 5th, 2003 means to me, and why I call it so much like my rebirth. I was literally shedding the old parts of me and allowing new skin to grow. Like, that's insane. But that's what all of us go through, right? All of us go through these phases of life where we're shedding parts of us, old parts of us, the dead skin, the part of us, the part of our story that doesn't necessarily need to be with us anymore. And then you're able to create a different story, create a different narrative, create a different direction, establish a new legacy, establish a new cycle, break an old one, eliminate an old one. But I was able to look at that skin on the pillow every morning and get to a point where I was almost fascinated by it instead of being triggered by it. I had started to take away the power from the day that I was injured and that experience and remembering the details. I was starting to take away the power from actually seeing my face and seeing my body because I was talking about it. I was thinking about it frequently. I started to do this exercise every morning and every evening where I would find something to be grateful for. And every morning I would have to be grateful for that I was alive, that I can see, that I can speak, that I can taste, that I can feel. I didn't have a lot of range of motion in my hands, but I had it. I could walk. There were still some things for me to be grateful about. I started to establish this mindset of this didn't happen to me. It happened for me. I was initially in the hospital for 3 months. And those 3 months, I had a lot of procedures, a lot of surgeries. Because my head is burned as well, the skin burns. Why it's so challenging is that what happens when they do skin grafts, when the grafts eventually start to tighten, they contract, and so it starts to pull the skin, right? In some cases, it means you have limited range of motion in one way or another. And so in my case, because of my eyes being burned and my head, it started to keep my eyelids open. I couldn't close my eyes. So even if I did this, it looked like I was awake. So they had to go in and do multiple releases on my eyes. I had my scarring came out all the way to here. So opening my mouth was about that extent. I couldn't really open my mouth. So anytime I ate something, it had to be cut up into these small bites. And they had to go in and do releases. I had scarring that came all the way down my neck. The reason why you see such a drastic contrast of scar, all of a sudden no scar, which seems to be perfectly fine skin, is because my chest wasn't burned. They did this procedure where they put a tissue expander in my chest and expanded that good skin and then literally cut out the bad scarring and pulled up the good skin and sewed it in. Incredible. I started to get hope that, oh man, okay, cool. I think I'm going to be okay. I think I'm going to be all right. They're putting me back together. I started 6 months after I was injured. I was going through the motions at the hospital. I had daily appointments with doctors and occupational therapists. And I remember one of my nurses asking me one day, why don't you go visit this patient who was having a difficult time, coming to terms with what happened to him? I said, no. And she said, why not? And I said, because I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. No. And she continued to insist on me doing this. And finally I was like, fine, okay, I'll do it. I'll try it. I remember going into his room and it was completely dark in the room. And I just thought to myself, man, he really is in a bad place. But I was already in the room. So I approached his bed. I stood next to his bed. I introduced myself and we started this conversation. And about 45 minutes went by, and I remember turning around and walking out of his room. But before I could exit the room, I stopped at the door, looked back into the room, and noticed that the light above his bed was on, and he was out of his bed, and he was opening the curtain to the huge window that was in his room. He was letting light in the room. And something so simple said so much to me. I gave this guy some hope. So instead of me ignoring that sign that life was giving me, instead, what I did is found my head doctor and I asked him, can I visit patients every single day in between my own appointments? He said, absolutely. And that's what I did. All morning, early afternoon was for me to do my appointments and everybody else to do theirs. In the evening, I did my rounds. I went and literally walked into all of these rooms. And I would talk to them. I say, hey, listen, I'm a patient here. This is what I've been going through. This is what I've seen that has improved for me. What's your story? What's going on with you? You got any questions? Family members would be there at the foot of the bed. Yeah, we actually have a question. Or he or she aren't ready to talk about it, but can you tell us about what your experience has been like? Once again, I'm talking about it so much, I'm removing the power from that day that forever changed my life. Instead, I'm now controlling the narrative. I'm creating the narrative. And most importantly, what I discovered shortly after was this element of service. I was walking away at the end when I would do my rounds and go back to my room that was across the street from the hospital. And I had this incredible feeling. And I remember thinking to myself, I know what that feeling is. I felt that before. That feeling is the same feeling I had when I was in the military, wanting to be in the military forever. Wait, it's service. I found it again. Oh, wait, I can serve in a very different way. I don't have to serve wearing that uniform. The new uniform now are the scars on my body. The new weapon now are the words that come out of my mouth. The way that I move through spaces when people watch me. Because people are always watching. When you have scars like I do, people are always watching. But if I smile, if I laugh, if I greet, now I'm using my weapon in a great way. Man. As I started to visit patients, I learned about some challenges a lot of the patients and their families were facing, most of them being financial. I got involved with the nonprofit, became a spokesman for this nonprofit, helping this nonprofit raise funds to support troops and their family members. And the biggest thing that I brought up is, for example, if you have somebody that usually, they're the spouse or a parent that has a job, all of a sudden now they have to be here with their loved one, helping them recover, be a caregiver. They lose that income. Well, guess what doesn't stop? Bills. They still keep coming. And I can't tell you the amount of times that I actually was in a room listening to a patient and a family member talk about how much money they had and how they can pay their bills. I remember the conversation myself being in the hospital in the first 3 months of telling my mother, here's my Bank of America card, right? Because I ended up getting a new one. Here's my PIN. Go get all the money, Mom, and pay the bills. That's the last thing you should be thinking about. So I got involved with this nonprofit to raise money to help these families. And as an active duty service member, you cannot endorse a private organization. Well, I didn't know that. So I would go on TV locally in San Antonio, nationally, and talk about this nonprofit and ask people to make donations. That's a no-no. And I found myself multiple times being called into the general's office, telling me that I could actually be medically, like I'd be Article 15, I could be kicked out, I could get in trouble, serious trouble, if I continue to do this. At this point, I'm literally sitting there and I'm 21 years old and I'm telling my doctor, I was like, well, the general, I was like, well, sir, if you have to kick me out, then do what you got to do. I'm not going to stop doing this because it's the right thing to do. That's how deeply embedded service was in my heart, that I was willing to be kicked out of the military because I believed that what I was doing was right. Of course, they never kicked me out because I kind of threw that little, I don't know where I learned this, but I threw that little, if you do this, oh, this won't look good for you either. I don't know where I learned that, but I learned it and I used it to my advantage. Then I started learning how to throw San Antonio and the hospital and the military a bone. In these interviews talking about this nonprofit, I would also really elevate and highlight this institution and everybody that was there and took care, how they took care of me and how they were taking care of these other troops, because it was true. It was kind of a win-win for everybody. I was literally tapping into service. I spent almost 3 years in the hospital. And that time I had over 30 surgeries, varied from a lot of different things. When I was 22 years old, oddly enough, I was now 22 when I was getting ready to get out of the military, and I was excited because now I had found my voice. I discovered that I had a story. I knew how to tell this story, and I wanted to go impact people. And I didn't want to limit it to just veterans and military personnel. I wanted to share it with the world. But I was leaving my safety net of the military. For 3 years, I could walk around Fort Sam Houston, which is where the hospital is located. I could walk around that base and yeah, people would look at me, but people always, just embraced me, accepted me. There was no judgment. I was leaving that safety net and now going into the civilian world where people aren't accustomed to seeing this. They don't have to accept me. They don't have to encourage me. They don't have to be nice to me. That was hard. I got into the civilian world. I started asking people for opportunities. Can you give me an opportunity to come and speak at your group, to present? People were always putting me in a box. You're a veteran. You're better off just talking to veterans. That's what they would say to me. The constant rejection, and not even the rejection, it was more of the unwillingness to actually listen to me and people only hearing me that literally triggered me and sent me into this negative space because I had healed physically. I hadn't healed mentally or emotionally. I told you I was 21. I was drinking. And when you mix alcohol with these emotions that I was feeling, I was an unpleasant kid because I was still trying to discover who I was. Because what I realized that I needed to do this work because that's what gave me life. And if I wasn't doing that work, I wasn't happy with myself. I needed to get to a place where I could be happy with me first and not have to do this work in order for me to survive. And it wasn't until my best friend, who's now my best friend, wasn't my best friend then. Back then, he was just a guy that was serving in the military that I knew. And we worked together at this nonprofit. And he said to me one night, you need to cry, man. You need to get it out. He encouraged me to cry. And he encouraged me to just unload everything that I'm carrying in my heart. I remember doing that. And let me tell you how powerful that moment was. Every time before that interaction, he would always leave me with, I love you. And I would always be like, okay, cool. All right, bro. Got you. The next day after that conversation where he encouraged me to cry, and I did, I was the first one to actually say I love you to him. It was the first time in my life that I'd actually looked at a man and said, I loved you, because my father left when I was 9 months old. He wasn't in my life. I wasn't conditioned to tell another man, I love you. And this man came in and actually created a safe space for me with no judgment and allowed me to be vulnerable. It was that same man that a few months later sent me an email to audition to become an actor on a soap opera called All My Children. He said, what do you have to lose, man? Just go and audition. What's the worst they could tell you? No? And I was like, you're right. So I responded to the email. I was actually flying to New York already, coincidentally. There's no coincidences in life. Can we agree to that? Just get that out of the way, right? There's no coincidences. Everything's happened the way it's supposed to happen. It's just up to us. Are we going to pay attention to it or not? But at that time, it was a coincidence that I was flying to New York. And so I fly to New York. I meet with the casting director, the executive producer. They tell me, come back in a month and we're going to do the audition. I said, okay, cool. Your casting call. I said, cool. I came back. I did the scene with the person that would presumably be my love interest on the show. About a week later, I got a call and was told that I got the job. I immediately had to move to New York. Immediately had to move. And here I was. I moved to New York. I remember asking them, how long am I going to be on the show? They said 3 months. I said, 3 months? Psh, that's plenty of time to be on a soap opera. That's cool. I'm going to be on a soap opera for 3 months? That's incredible. I'm fine with that. But every day I showed up willing to work, willing to learn, willing to challenge myself. Because if it was only going to be 3 months, it was going to be an incredible 3 months. Well, then it turned into 6 months. 9 months, a year, 18 months. It turned into 3 years of me being on that show. And the only reason I got off of the show is because the show canceled. The show ended. What would happen, though, is we would do these fan events. And I was the least known character on the show, right? I was new. And I would do these fan events, and I remember sitting in the back, and you would have these fans asking Susan Lucci or Debbie Morgan or Michael Knight or, Alicia Minshew, like all these big characters. They would ask him all these questions. And I remember one particular day, a lady asking me a question. And she asked me, JR, would you ever consider going on Dancing with the Stars? I think you would do good on that show. I was like, I guess. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I can dance. Right, jokingly. Fast forward to all my children announces that they're going to cancel. I get calls, and I get one particular call from someone that says, hey, man, whatever happened to that Dancing with the Stars thing? And I was like, that's like the second time it's come up. So I asked my wife. She was my girlfriend then, but I asked my wife. I said, what do you think about this? She's like, you should go and talk to the executive producer of all my children. She knows, see what she says. I called the executive producer, Julie, who's become a close friend to our family. And she's like, you'd be great. Let me make the call. She makes the call, a meeting's set up. I go in, I meet with the casting director and one of the producers of Dancing with the Stars. They, of course, ask me all of these questions about myself, and they say, okay, cool, we'll keep you posted. That was in May of 2011. I didn't get an invite to be part of that season 13, until August of 2011. They kept, hey, we should have an answer soon. What I later found out is that they were trying to get a bigger name. So they were just kind of keeping me there, trying to get that bigger name. Eventually, they didn't get that name, so they were just like, okay, cool, this will be a cool story. So, Jerry, would you be a part of season 13? I said, yes. And, there was all these stories going around that people thought that I would go home week 3, week 4. And I was like, I think I can stick around for a while. Because what people don't know about me is that I was raised by a single mother. A woman that when she needed a dance partner, she came to me. So by default, I just have some dance experience. I went on that show, again, paired up with Karina Smirnoff and just listened to the constructive criticism, really worked and listened and tried to, get better every single week, won the competition. After that, wrote a book. Now I was speaking all over the world. Now people understood the value that my story can bring to an audience that wasn't exclusive to the military. People got it now. But I look at everything that I have been able to do. Everything. And yes, my name may be on it. Maybe my face that's shown. But it's never really about me. Everything that I do is to try to represent and be an example for all of the communities that I represent. Not just military personnel, not just burn survivors, not burn victims, survivors. But to also kids who may have a father that left when they were 9 months old, who may have moved a lot in their childhood, who may have been bullied and felt out of place and couldn't find their community, who may deal with some sort of quote unquote disability. I personally don't like disability. And if you have to use the word, which I get, because we are so quick to label things that we don't quite understand, so we put the word disability on it. I had that word over my head for a very long time. And every day I've made the choice to diss the dis and disability and prove to the world that the only thing that should be highlighted is my ability. I represent people. I'm Hispanic. I represent esa comunidad. I'm proud to be Hispanic. I'm proud to be from El Salvador. I say that because, yes, I am from there. So much of my mother and my family on my mother's side has shaped me, has helped me, has given me perspective. So this story, yes, it may be me and you see my face and hear my voice. But I'm only, as I like to believe, only a vessel being used to be an example and to give people hope and to hopefully allow people to understand that there are signs out there that are being presented to us every single day. And you can overcome anything and everything. But it comes down to you. What are you going to put your mind to? What are you going to believe? What are you going to tap into? Are you willing to be vulnerable? Are you willing to talk? Are you willing to try to hand this off and say to somebody, I need help. I can't do this by myself. We're all experiencing rebirths. We have the opportunity to experience rebirths. So I hope that you have been able to take something away from this story, take something away from my life and what I've experienced over the last 18 years. And then when we see each other in person, or even if it's here in a comment, that you're able to share your tattoo with me, your story with me. And the next time we see each other in person, remind me to show you the tattoo, because it's symbolic to me. I think it's symbolic to all of us. Peace and love to every single one of you. Keep your head up. Know that you're not alone. Know that you have a voice. Know that you have a purpose. And know that life is meant to be lived and to be experienced. Don't live in fear. Go out there and create that story that you want for your own book. Take care.